Hello, welcome to Casual Conversations. My name is Katherine Snedaker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the founder and CEO of PINK Concussions. And this show is hosted by IBIA and NABIS. And we're in our fourth season now, and we will have shows through June. We will have a break, our annual break during the summer, and we will be back with you, hopefully with some live events at the IBIA, NABIS, PIBIS, and legal conference in New York City in September. So today I have Hana Walker-Brown, and we're going to talk about Hana's book, The Delicate Game. So welcome, Hana. I hear you're in London.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks.
How's London today?
It's quite warm today, you know. We've had some, I don't know, up and down weather for spring, but today it feels like maybe we might have some nice weather. But yeah, it's busy, it's fine. I'm happy to be here chatting to you after so long.
Well, I didn't know whether to start when we first met, but that cycles into everything else. So let's just start at the beginning with you. Where were you born? Sure. And tell us a little bit about Hana's first years.
Well, I was born actually in southeast London, and then my parents moved to the north of England when I was young, divorced quite quickly after that. So I kind of grew up between a place called Yorkshire, a place called Lincolnshire, and then London. So I have a bit of a kind of mongrel accent. I don't know how hot you are in your English accents, but I have like northern vowels, which means I say bath and much instead of bath and much. So that kind of betrays me sometimes in some circles if I'm trying to be a bit posher than I am. But yeah, so I grew up between the three. I've always had a lot of people around me, even though my families were quite small. I had kind of extended step families quite quickly, and my parents had a lot of friends. So I think that was quite a good grounding for me to engage with people, meet a lot of people, be comfortable in like the presence of people. And I think that kind of set me in good stead for kind of the career I've had and why I want to be around, and I'm curious about people. But yeah, it was, you know, we kind of started off working class. Both my parents worked quite hard, sort of went up a little bit into the middle classes, but I think that kind of working class ethic and mentality has always been quite strong in me, and I'd say a bit of a fighter. I was kind of whisked away into an incubator for the first 9 weeks of my life, so I sort of came in fighting, and I guess I'll probably go out fighting about something, for something, hopefully for something, not with someone. But yeah, that was kind of the early years, I suppose.
And it is incredibly hard to sit with people in pain, but you go beyond that and invite them to share more of it with you. Is that baked into you, or was that an experience that you had as growing up in a family where pain was discussed?
I think it was probably more so baked into me. I think it wasn't ever kind of hidden in my family. It wasn't kind of that there were no-go areas. Like, we spoke about a lot and saw pain a lot, you know, witnessed that in both parents. So kind of, I guess I'd learned to sit with that and hold space for that even as a kid. And I think as I grew older, that's just what I wanted to do. I wanted to be around people, and it wasn't a kind of, you know, there's a very fine line between going after someone's pain for a story and actually feeling compelled to do something because you know that you can. And I definitely sit in the latter of that. And again, I trained to be a yoga teacher for many years, and it's kind of the same principle. Like, you're there to hold a space for someone into which they can be vulnerable, and they're safe to express themselves in however they please. And it's kind of the same with making documentary or interviewing people. Like, you're there to hold a space where it's safe to be vulnerable and they can express themselves how they please. So I don't know, I think that's part of my character, that people trust that I'm there for the right reasons. And I guess there were elements of that as a kid, but I don't think it's something I grew up doing. Like, my parents wouldn't sit me down and be like, today we're going to talk about trauma and this is traumatic. But I think, you know, there were occasions where a parent had been like particularly upset, or like the divorce was quite horrendous, and kind of the aftermath of that rolled on for years, it was quite difficult. So I think I have witnessed a lot of those things. And as a kid, you want to help, like you want to find a solution, especially when it's a parent that's, you know, unhappy. So maybe that was part of it, but I do think it's kind of, it's in my nature. And I actually see it in my nephew now, who's 3, and how he responds to people in pain and how it upsets him and he wants to make it better, or he wants to do something. So I don't know, maybe there's something in that, but yeah, that's quite a rambly explanation to say.
No, but it's,
a bit
but
of
it's
both.
really, I believe it's really important to who you are, because not only
Yeah.
are you inviting and welcoming, but then you open the space for people to share. And you wrote a book about many people that I know and love. So the book felt intimate to me, about people that I actually know, right? I wasn't just reading about strangers. But then you take what you have learned and then work to create a better situation. The journalism piece and also the social work piece, which I find so fascinating about your work. You really care.
Yeah, I do, which, you know, it's not always ideal to care. You know, it means that you carry a lot, and obviously not as much as the people that whatever has happened to, but it's very hard to kind of separate yourself from whatever the work is. I say work, or whatever the kind of end result of whatever you've done is. But I do really care, and I think that's important. And I think actually in a lot of, especially kind of social justice, social impact things, there is a kind of base level of awareness that people have, but I don't think there is a base level of understanding. And I think it is only in the understanding that allows you to kind of evoke empathy, or feel empathy, or sympathy, or have any idea of what is going on, that ultimately could compel you to act. And I think, well, there's an awareness, it still feels like something that happens over there. But if you root it in something very human, that could be your kid, could be your dad, could be your brother, and you put that front and center, then people start to understand what's going on. It's not just an awareness. And that's what I wanted to do, really. I felt that there was real power in that, in ensuring that, you know, all of those people in the book are celebrated or remembered or honored, but secondly, that, you know, you wouldn't even need to know these people to read those chapters and care about them. And that's what I've seen is, you know, even people who had no awareness of concussion, of TBI, of sport, are picking up that book, and they care about, you know, Karen and Peter, and they care about Benjamin Robinson, and they care about Dawn Astle as a person, not just as a voice of this debate that's kind of raging on.
How do you get from a kid with this sort of baked in talent to this point where you have the bandwidth to tackle such a huge topic? You ever had to, for a part of your career, do something you didn't care about?
I did for many years. Well, my dad will say that my first storytelling experience was when I was 4, and he found me. My dad was a sound engineer. I've told this story before, and I'll tell it again because it's good. But my dad was a sound engineer in London, and he happened to be in on a recording of Jimi Hendrix when he was no one, and Engelbert Humperdinck, who was like an old crooner, and Jimi Hendrix was supporting Engelbert Humperdinck on tour. And in the studio one day, they just started singing together, and someone just pressed record, and my dad had the tape, only one tape in existence. And he came home one day, and I had miraculously found that tape in his collection, put it in a cassette player, press record, and I was like recording stories into this tape recorder, and lost the whole tape. So he had not, he could have retired on that tape, and I ruined everything. Then I was like, at least I kind of followed through and went into like audio storytelling, and, you know, I hope I've kind of been consistent. But I think I was always very curious about people, always asked a lot of questions, always wrote stories, very imaginative. Like, I was later diagnosed with ADHD, so I did internalize a lot of things as a kid, worked really, really hard, was really good at school, like had friends, was still kind of get up on stage singing, dancing, acting, but I had a very kind of busy and vibrant inner world, I suppose. So I guess that's kind of creativity was started there, and it was how I expressed myself. I found it a lot easier if I was on a stage versus in real life, or if I was writing it down. And then I guess something just happened, and it just started being about conversation, and it started being about other people, and that allowed me a level of distance, because I didn't want to be the person that was doing the talking, but if I could tell other people stuff, then that I felt was a good thing, and it didn't mean that I had to kind of stand in the front. So, you know, my career has always been behind the scenes, not in front of the camera. But in order to kind of facilitate a creative endeavor, I have had to work really horrible jobs. I worked in a fish factory for a long time to subsidize things. I've worked in horrible, horrible hospitality places in London that kind of just city men talking to you like you're dirt constantly. And every time I'd get the bus at like 4 a.m, I was like, one day I'm never going to do this again. And, you know, I don't have to do it anymore. But I guess I don't know, there was just something in me that knew I could make a difference. And I don't mean like on a massive scale, but even on kind of a micro level, I knew there was something I could do that would change things. And that I've been driven by forever. Like, and so I think if you feel like that, you do whatever it takes to do that. So if I have to do 2 jobs on the side in order to do the writing, or I have to kind of, you know, put all of my time and energy into building a career and not like relationships, for example, then I'm going to do that. So I don't know, it's just always been there, and I've never questioned it. I've just gone with it.
What was the first piece that you did that you're like, I'm now getting to what I want to do? And then how far was that to the Beautiful Brain audio?
Yeah, the first piece, I guess, so I studied drama, and then I did a radio module there, and I realized how much I loved being in sound, and how much I hated being around actors and directors, and the bitchiness of that. And so I'd just go in this radio studio, and what I'd do is I'd record people's stories, and then I'd start sound designing around them, like not really knowing it was a thing. It was just this fun thing I did. So, you know, I'd go and interview my friend about something that happened, and I'd take that into the radio studio and start making music around it, or sound effects, and started building this portfolio basically. And it was the studio engineer that said, you know, you're really good at this, I think you should go and study it. Like, I reckon you could get on a master's course. So I applied for Goldsmiths in London to do the radio MA, which was really expensive, and luckily I got in on a scholarship. That was when I realized that what I'd been doing was actually this thing, which was kind of radio documentary, which would then become podcasts. Like, you know, there's huge industry that now is booming. Like, that's what I was doing. And I was like, I had no idea. And I think actually that served me quite well, because a lot of people had gone in being like, I want to make radio, I have to work for the BBC. And I was like, oh, I'm just making these things that, you know, I think sound cool. And I made a piece with one of my oldest friends about, it was only a 5-minute piece, and it was a fight he got into that left him with 4 metal plates in his face. And you know, I do all my own music and sound design, and I'd created this 5-minute piece that then Goldsmith submitted for an award, like a national award, and it won. And that was kind of a moment for me where I was like, oh, okay, there's something in this, there's something in like what I'm doing. And so I started doing more and listening to a lot of other things, and that really was the piece that kind of, I mean, obviously it's nice to have the validation that, you know, you're worth an award from people that have been doing it for years, but also it was like the comments that people said about how I'd managed to convey so much intimacy in like 5 minutes, how they felt they were right there with him throughout the story. And so that kind of started it. And then over like those next, I guess it was 8 years later that I made The Beautiful Brain, I was just making radio documentaries, playing with sound design, winning more awards, but actually just really harnessing what I'd done and sticking to what I'd done, rather than getting bogged down in what's the right way to do it. I was like, I'm going to do this my way. I'm going to keep cultivating that. And it's not to say I thought I was, you know, the best or perfect at that point, but it was like, no, I've got something here, I need to stick with that and kind of tunnel vision on this, rather than worry about what everyone else is doing. And actually one of the pieces that really, I mean, still means so much to me, was the first kind of feature length documentary I made, which was called The Fishwife's Tale, which was with a woman called Jane Dolby, whose husband had got lost at sea, and you don't get any life insurance if there isn't a body. So she had young children to raise. She had absolutely no. Her husband was missing, presumed dead, but they didn't know. And so she started a choir in the pub for fisherwives, and they basically got to like the number one. They had like Christmas number one in the UK. They beat One Direction, and it was they're like these raucous Essex women who like swear all the time but have these amazing voices, and they just came together in this moment of just utter desperation and created this beautiful thing. And later her husband's body did wash up, and so then they got the insurance and they were okay. But I got to spend so much time with her and follow her around for months, and we actually became friends. And I remember someone saying to me, you should never get too close because it's not your job to care. And I thought, but this is why your work sounds so distant and so reportive, and I've always thought, show and don't tell. I don't want to tell someone what they should be feeling, but if I show you everything I've seen, then you're going to feel what happened in that moment. And I just thought that was a really cold and stupid way to do things, because if you're asking so much time from these people, of course you have to care. And I also think, if you're going into an interview, someone knows in a second if you care or not. If you're there with like your questions in front of your face, you're not like holding eye contact with them, you're not kind of being there in the moment with them, then they're not going to tell you everything, because why should they? Whereas if you're doing it because you do care and you're there for them and you're there to actually listen, not just kind of edit in your head what they're saying to make your story. But yeah, spending time with her, and we're still friends. She came to my 30th birthday and I did that interview with her when I was 23.
You'd already worked on the piece with your friend with the fight with the metal plates. Where did brain injury for the beautiful brain, did it come from the sports realization, or where did that first come from? And we're talking about an audio book that you won top UK, if not larger awards.
Yeah.
Where
that you're in. So it's kind of covered in the first chapter of my book, but I was making a documentary, or actually like a sound installation piece, with a BMX club in Southeast London where I was living at the time. A BMX club has gone on to create Olympians, like Trey White won, or Kai White won the silver medal this year in the Olympics for BMX. So these are like kids from like rough estates, council estates, that they try and discourage from gang life and put them on the BMX track, and they're incredible. So I was making a documentary about that and a sound piece to go with it, and one of the kind of conditions of making the doc was that I had to try BMX, and there's some very hilarious photos of me thinking I look cool, but on my face I'm just terrified about to go down this Olympic track, which is really fun, but yeah, very scary. And my friend sent me an article about Dave Mirra, who's a world champion BMX rider, who had just gone out one day and shot himself in the head, pulled up to his friend's driveway and shot himself. And they found CTE in a post-mortem. And I'd sort of seen a bit of, I remember watching Concussion, but not really, and hearing about it in the NFL, but that really struck me, I guess because I was doing the BMX stuff, but also there was a line in there from his friends who had been texting him this article thinking it was fake news because they couldn't believe that he would have done that. And that was when it hit me, and I was like, this is madness. Why does this thing exist and it's not talked about all the time, and that can be an outcome? So I started looking into it. Originally I wanted to make a series on Dave Mirra, and I had pitched it to Audible at the time, who were in touch with me about doing some work. And they were like, maybe it's, but what is the English story? And I was like, I'm sure there's one. Like, this is an NFL thing. If he's got it from the crashes in BMX, like, I'm sure it's elsewhere. So then I had developed it for a year, and then it kind of started coming out about the 66 team, the World Cup team, and their dementia diagnosis.
And what year are we here? Just
2016.
2016.
2016, yeah. And then I spoke to Dawn Astle, and I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was in a cafe near where I used to live, and we spoke on the phone for like 2.5 hours. And I was like, that's it, that's what I have to tell. And so it started there, and I went to interview her again extensively, and her mum, various other people, and then it just kind of snowballed. And I think at one point I was like, domestic violence, surely that's something. And I think, I can't remember which came first, whether it was Helena, Eva, or you, but whoever was first, you linked me to the others, who linked me to the others,
Yeah.
and then there was just this chain,
I
and
think
it
it was
rolled and
you and
rolled and
me,
rolled.
because you and I met in New York.
Yeah, we did in 2018.
Right. And I remember you invited me to your hotel, and you said you just come on. And it was like such an intimate place to come and meet you on a street corner. Was there any idea at the time that it would become a book, or was
No.
it all at that point sound?
All of that, at that point, it was all audio. And I knew I would write the script for the book, so like the audio book, and that would feed in. But no, it wasn't a book. The book came after I saw how well the podcast was received, and also this feeling of like, I've got to do more. You can't just walk away from this. You can't just put it down.
What the award was, one of the Audible's top across any category?
Yeah, it won a few. And then it was like, the April it was released, it was number 2 in the New York Times.
Which is just amazing, because brain is a really narrow topic compared to other things that could be on audio. So the success of that was fantastic.
Yeah, it really was. And I think it was you as well that said about the women that had found you from listening to it. And that I thought, okay, there's something here, there's power in this work. And actually in delivering it human story first, you could do that. And that's when I started working on the book proposal.
As a creator of audio, what's the value of a book in 2022?
I think it lives and it exists. I think a lot of people, as much as podcasting is like a $4 billion industry, people still don't know what they are, especially in the UK. I think a book, it's tangible, you can hold it, you can share it. And I think it brings in so many more people. You don't have to use an app on your phone to get it. It's in the libraries, you can rent it. And I think now the information is there, and it's down on paper. And I don't know, there's something about kind of when you're making kind of documentary audio or otherwise, it kind of exists and then it disappears. But this kind of, it's here now, and it I don't know, there's something about having something tangible you can hold in your hands, I think, that's so important. You look confused.
No, I was trying to, someone was asking me a question to them. No, absolutely. And with social media and the power of social media, books still stand.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think they will ever not stand. And I think like key texts and quoting from books, and I just think also it was important to me to have those stories together as well, because I think a lot of the time articles are quite disparate, or like Beautiful Brain, even though it looked at domestic violence, it was mostly the Astle story, no sports came in. But there's a power in having all of these people, like yourself included, side by side in one place, because you can't argue with that. You can argue with the odd article on Twitter, or debate an article at a time, but when you see it all together like that, I think there's no argument that can be had.
And for those that joined us late, we are talking about Hannah's book, A Delicate Game. And I read it. I read pieces of it when it arrived. And then I knew I read it 3.5 hours yesterday, cover to cover. And at one point, wow. I had to break from it. I was on a plane. I had to break, and I contacted you through WhatsApp, which we never used, but I was sitting there like bawling on the plane, and I didn't want to talk to the lady next to me in the seat. So I'm like, I'm just going to, I don't know if she'll answer, but I just, so it was it was very emotional to read about people that I love very much and knew their stories, people I'd spoken to, Peter and Karen, about the death of their son, Ben. And I've spoken to them on the phone, but reading your book, it was like being there, It's just describing the day before and the night before. And I never had talked to Karen and Ben in that way, Karen and Peter that way about Ben, and just the detail that you made people I know and love even more real. I don't know how to say that, but I was just really taken back by that. And you did a beautiful job with it.
Thank you. Yeah, and they were so generous with their time and allowing me to tell Benjamin's story. And again, I think I mentioned to you before, though, you know, Karen read what was going to be printed. That was really important to her, which obviously I would honor, because it's, you know, it's her son, it's their story. So I wanted to make sure that it honored him and it represented them. And actually, I flew to Northern Ireland to meet her and sit with her and, you know, hear about Benjamin. Peter I'd spoken to extensively on the phone because it was all through lockdown, so no one could go anywhere. But, you know, I went to see Karen when I could in January. And I don't know, the thing that I realized that with everyone in the book is it doesn't matter whether it's 10, 20, 30 years later, those memories are still so vivid, and they will always be so vivid. Like those horrendous moments, like they will tell in full color, and you are right there. And that's all my job is, to translate what I've heard to the reader. You know, there's no kind of sorcery or, you know, putting any embellishments in there. It's like, what did I feel in that moment, and what are they saying? And that's my responsibility to communicate that. So yeah, it's hard. I think that was really hard. And also John Gall, in one of the final chapters, who loses his son, that was like one of the last interviews I did for the book, and it was the only time I couldn't hold it together, because I'm also very aware that, you know, when I go into these spaces, I empty out of anything of myself, any of my own kind of emotions, or, you know, I'm there to be there, but, you know, I'm not there to kind of cry with you and hug you and tell you it's okay. You know, I'm there to listen. But that was a moment I really couldn't. I think it was kind of at the end, and we were peak lockdown 3, I think, and it was winter, and the way he just told this story, it was.
But there's so much in your book, and in working on my own book, which I told you I'm not sure whether I'm inspired to absolutely finish my book or throw it in the trash can, but
no,
you
to write it, to finish it.
Well, you know, the detail that the ways you write, the dogs coming through the room, way someone holds a cigarette, it's so fascinating. And you literally start on page 1, and I don't know how anyone can't just read through the whole book. And I always think of every detail has to be on a timeline, and this, and then this, and then this. But you jump between stories in a way that, I mean, I think only someone in ADHD can take all this information and weave it into a great fabric. And even the piece where you went really deep on American football and NFL and 100 years of history with CTE, and parts that, you know, I've known about for a decade, you still did that with such skill. And, you know, I think as a European looking at it, also was able to hold it at arm's length in a way, to weave it in a way that I found really interesting.
Thank you. I think a lot of that practice, again, ADHD does help, but I think also being like an audio documentary maker and editor, so I see how things should go in my head, and I know where to move them. And I think I tried to approach this in the same way, which was slightly more tricky because it's really hard looking at pages and pages of writing. But actually that's what I was doing, sort of thinking about these sections and then putting them together. So I didn't write the book kind of from start to finish. The first chapter I wrote was number 9, the one on domestic violence. And then I'd maybe write a bit of 2 and then a bit of 10. And, you know, it was an absolute nightmare for the publisher, because they were like, can we have it chapter at a time? And I was like, no, you can have it all in one, which I did do. But I was like, the way my brain works, I need to just be constantly doing whatever bit I want to do. And then I'll start to put it together, and then I'll really interrogate those things. So I don't know. I feel it, probably to an outsider, it looks very chaotic and not you know, if you're working with someone else, it would be an absolute nightmare. But I think it just, I had that freedom to do it how I needed to do it. I've never written a book before, so, you know, I'm sort of starting from zero. But yeah, it definitely, having that audio editing structure in mind definitely helped, I think.
And I think brain injury is there are so many parts. And I started with the tagline in 2012, PINK Concussions, sports, domestic violence, and military service. And that it all seemed to connect to me. And you know, I've said multiple times why, but people would argue with me and just tell me I was wrong. And I never backed down from it. But in how you wove your book talking about, you know, and you threw in a whole section about the church and you know, how the importance of sport and got wrapped into Christianity and the, you know, rugby and soccer and football all wrapped up into the male entity and how we deal with pain and fighting through, you know, so I found that fascinating.
Yeah, and I think actually, again, I make reference through kind of the documentaries I've made where this stuff has been uncovered. So like that idea of sport as ideology, which I saw in Bangladesh when, you know, just the kind of the triumph of human spirit was like, it's something to believe in. I think that's what sport does. It gives us something to believe in, and you know, we're all united. And I again mentioned it in the book, but like, you'll never see London as friendly as when England are winning.
Right.
Like they are, people will smile at you on the tube, they will hold doors open. And you know, we saw it with the kind of the World Cup teams, like whenever they're doing well, like the city is like alive and vibrant and happy. And you know, you cannot deny that power that it has. But I think it sometimes does take someone on the outside. Like I don't come from sport and I don't come from science, so I think I can see both for kind of what they are, and you can really start to unpack those. Whereas I think if you're embedded in sport, sometimes it's harder to see the wood for the trees. You know, you kind of, and again, it's really hard for us to accept that something we love might be bad for us, and that is in terms of not just sport, but you know, anything. And I think actually, if you're outside of that and you enjoy sport and you play sport, but you can actually see what's going on, I think that's kind of allowed me that perspective overall.
And in this country, and I'm sure it is so enmeshed, because if you want to study brain injury, the first place they go is to American football fields. Like they aren't sitting at swim meets. They aren't sitting, you know, at other, they, you know, it's, you could sit on the freeway. We could have, you know, brain injury research up and down the freeways of America. No, they're at football games. So that, you know, my funding comes from football and that spin in this country. And you also, I think, was really good to clear up that, you know, the elements of CTE that, you know, date back 100 years ago, and the terms, because that narrative has been confused and twisted along the way. So I thought you did a really good job pulling out those elements. And the NCAA, which is our national sports organization, the first head of the NCAA was the top commander, not headmaster, but from West Point. So, you know, this idea that sports in the institutions are creating men that can be soldiers, and that connection back and forth between the need of athletics creating a part of your society that would be available to the military if needed. So there are all these pieces. I hadn't gotten into the church piece of it, but I think that's the part about brain injury that makes it so fascinating, of all these different elements. What was the most surprising thing for you in writing the book and putting it all together about brain injury? Is there something that was your biggest wow, or something you didn't expect?
I think the thing that really surprised me that I actually hadn't thought about is when the focus is only on the professionals and the Premier Leagues, it's not just about their safety and making sure they're safe, but the responsibility to kind of advocate and be a role model for grassroots and kids. And actually the fact that there is no kind of, we sort of mentioned this yesterday, but there isn't a kind of like baseline rule or training for to protect kids. You know, coaches can download a thing from a rugby website, like a scat. It's not for kids, but they can or they can't. And I think that really surprised me, that, you know, the focus is always on, you know, keep the players safe, but whatever those players do, grassroots copy. And, you know, kids are going to copy their, you know, their heroes. They copy everything they see. And that, I think, was something I hadn't thought about before, but how that trickles down. And it was meeting people like Karen and Peter and hearing what they had been through and still go through, to be honest. You know, other parents still go through. I had a lot of people reach out to me privately who are going through this, that aren't ready to share their story because they're terrified of what the sport will do to them, or what the fans will do to them, or the abuse they face. And I do think now we're in a much better position than, say, even 4 years ago when I brought up Beautiful Brain, because there is more of an understanding and more litigations. And as we know, like money talks, people's ears prick up when there's money involved. But I think it was kind of how that had been sidelined, how this affects kids had been sidelined. And that's down to people saying that Benjamin Robinson's case was rare, or saying it was a freak accident, and, you know, the language involved in this, and actually, you know, how we all have a part to play, from like the commentators and how they communicate what's happened, to how it's written about in press, to the kind of conversations we have on Twitter, and even in terms of masculinity, like how we speak to kids, you know, like get up and get on with it, which is a great thing to learn in being resilient. But, you know, when it comes to things like a brain injury or concussion, like that's not the way to do it. It's like get up and get off, not kind of get up and get on. And that's confusing when you've been told your whole life, you know, be brave, you can do it. So many like nuances involved in it. I think it's not just about, you know, sport and science. It's kind of, it's very human, I think, at its core, and how we treat each other and how we treat ourselves, and behavior. And so that was super interesting to me. But yeah, definitely the impact it's having on those people who don't have access to the best doctors in the world, that can't take 6 weeks out because they're not paid an enormous salary, or who might not even have the education and information to know that there was something wrong. I think for a long time, a lot of people were alone in this. And I think things like social media have really helped to mend that, because now people can find each other. You can share research with someone in Australia in like a tweet. So I think that's really allowed it to kind of a more level playing field, and you can't argue with the numbers now. I think before people could, but now there's a new case every day in multiple sports. There's a new family coming out, or, you know, we see it on the television, and those clips are shared millions of times, versus before it might happen in a match, you'd only see it if you were watching, there was no replay. So I think technology has a huge impact now on where this is going.
No, absolutely. And that term that, you know, this is a, you know, you're more likely to be hit by lightning. This is a absolutely rare occasion. This is, you know, never seen this before, you know, and the, you know, the connection of the parents to the coaches, or the parents to the school, or the parents to the teammates, and the teammates to the school. There's so much going on in that moment. However, I've been in a national, I've been in spaces with national leaders where I have not been allowed to tweet. There's been an embargo on me saying anything in that moment, but I have seen insurance and lawyers come up and say, if there is a catastrophe and a child is killed or a brain injury, here's the words to use. You use those words. You use, this is, you know, an unforeseeable, unbelievable, this has never been happened before, you know, and get the good PR people in there, and the PR and it's, you know, it's the playbook that was the railroad industry used it, and then the tobacco industry used it, and the football, and now we're back to the vape people going back to what the tobacco. I mean, it's the same playbook, which is deny, then come up with your own academic research and fund people to say what you want, and then when you back out, you bought yourself 40 years.
Yeah, or you say, we don't know for sure, we don't know for sure, we need a longitudinal study, by which point you're 10, 20 years down the line, that's a whole new 2 generations of people going through the same thing. And, sport is kind of evolving at a monstrous level. Like, you look at rugby players now, they're enormous. Like, they are like giants compared to what they were. There's also, it's filmed and shared all over the world, so they're playing with much more ferocity. They're trying to entertain people again and again and again, and what entertains people is those big hits and the violence. And I think, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So the more they kind of say, we don't know for sure, or we can't quantify this with a number, it's like with cigarette smoking. You didn't know if it was 300 cigarettes or 3 million or ever that would give you cancer or any other kind of respiratory disease based on smoking, but with every one that you're taking a risk. And I think this is the same situation. You can't quantify whether it's 10 hits, 100 hits, a decade of hits, or you might never get CTE, but with every one you're taking a risk. And I think there is such a strong argument for erring on the side of caution, because you don't want to get 10 years down the line and go, oh yeah, maybe we shouldn't have done that, because now we're seeing men in their 20s with dementia, late 20s, 30s, 40s, and that's insane. You can't argue that that's nature. So I think you're right. It's deny, throw a longitudinal study in, or settle, but with no acknowledgement of accountability.
Yeah. And I think with the youth sport piece, because that's in 2009 and 2010 when I entered the space, because the CDC had all of these stickers and clipboards and water bottles and all of this stuff, and all you had to do was go on the website and order it. But there was no mechanism for implementing this social change, this safety change into youth sports. And as donors, we want to see, like, how many concrete things did you produce? But I'm going to pay for the social implementation of the program. That's not really the tangible that I think donors want to see. So I think too often these things have been, well, we had it on the website. Derek Shealy was a 23-year-old football player who sustained a number of hits over a beginning season, and was bleeding from his head, wanting to go off, and went to go off. The coach said, don't be a pussy, go back there. And so I think he was a 5th year senior. Here's almost an adult, but still a student, going back on the sport. And later it was his teammates that came forward. In Ben's story, teammates knew. Karen was walking up and down the field, and even said something. So Rowan, I think her
Stringer.
Rowan. So all of these kids along the way that I met their parents, that really motivated me to keep going, that, if people are educated on the sidelines, if the teams are educated, we can't just put it all, well, if you're feeling wonky, you should have raised your hand, right?
Yeah.
I always say it's like asking a drunk if they're okay to drive.
Yeah.
So
it's so true.
Those families change out every 6 years. Like every 6 years, the entire new youth sports thing passed at the city level, and we're the only city in my state that every team that rents city fields and rents city courts and city pools has to have all their coaches do the CDC concussion education, 20 minutes on the phone. And the first huge mess, and then years after, it was like, oh yeah, we just do that. But I think we're the only city that does that. So it's this pieces where we have volunteers, and I loved youth sports with my kids. I had so much fun with lacrosse, soccer. So it's that balance of how do we take the great parts of sports, which we all really missed at the pandemic, and create something that may look different slightly, because sport is always changing. We always think that the way the sport is now is the way it's always been. But how can we modify stuff to keep sports, but not have to have these sacrifices?
Because we modify everything else. We evolve everything else. We don't do the same stuff we did 20, 30 years ago. And I think, the hardest thing to change is the culture around it. And I think, again, those decisions can't be in the hands of parents, because Karen's a prime example. No one listened to her, right? Kid isn't going to listen to his parent. If you say, I don't need to do that, they're going to do it anyway. So, you know, and if you start with kids and that is what they know, they're not going to then later on be like, oh, I'm going to do it this way. If you start now kind of teaching them, and, you know, if you gave a kid a rugby ball and said, right, you've got half an hour, invent a new game. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can do this. They'd create a game. Like, they're, you know, they have imagination. And I guess like soccer's the easiest one, because you don't have to use your head. You really don't. Like, you play it with your feet and the game is absolutely fine. You know, maybe there's 2 heads of a ball in a match, but 98% like it's on the feet. So things like rugby, NFL are slightly harder, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I think a lot of the questioning or the argument for not wanting it to change is actually based on the spectator's entertainment out of someone else's enjoyment. And it's like, you know, what do they say? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it is broken, like it's so broken. And I think there's such an opportunity to create something new and exciting. And it doesn't mean that it couldn't be the same, and as in the same enjoyment. But I do wonder what people are afraid of losing, because it is rooted in something so long ago that doesn't serve us anymore. And I wonder where that fear comes from, like why people are reluctant to change it, and whether that actually just comes down to, if they change the sport, then is that an admission of accountability in that something isn't right? And I wonder if it literally just comes down to the money and accountability.
Yeah. And so you have this book, it's now coming out in, you know, hardcover, paperback, audiobook. Do you feel like you know, put a cap and put a bow on it and you're done with this topic? Is there more
No.
you want to explore?
Yeah, there's definitely more I want to explore. I've been speaking to a lot of like not-for-profits and charities about how I could be helpful. So I guess, you know, my skills as communicating, as interviewing, how they can sit side by side with science, with families, with activists. Because I want to be helpful. And I think, you know, well, I don't know where it's going to go. I'm kind of really, I don't like into neuroscience now. I'd quite like to do an applied course in neuroscience, and, you know, it's definitely not the end. I don't know if it's, I'd never, ever, ever thought that this would be a subject that I would go down, but here I am, 6 years in.
And I have to say, you know, it's still fascinating to me 10 years later to try to pick pieces. I mean, we could talk for so long.
So I know from a sport angle, there's tiny amount of research on women in CTE. I think there's like a handful of papers. There's 2 papers, the Punch Drunk Wife,
2
and another 2, yes.
And they were both written back to back in 1989 and 90.
Yeah, a long time ago. And one was an autistic girl, one was, well, ultimately victim of domestic violence because she died. So in terms of CTE and sport, so for example, soccer players, the kind of mid-center that have a lot of heading of the ball are 5 times more likely than the general population to develop a neurological disorder. So, and that is with repeated hits to the head. So I don't know about a kind of, if it's one traumatic brain injury or if it's, you know, the severity of that, you know, I don't know. But with CTE, what they do know is it is the repetition of, well, accumulation of repetition to the head. And I know in terms of sports, so these are guys that are heading a football 100 times a week, maybe.
Yeah.
And they are 5 times more likely than the general population to develop CTE. So and again, it's one of those things that can't be quantified. And I think that's why there is still so much gray area, because science kind of can't be sold on inconsistencies. But I don't know kind of the percentage of developing that from a traumatic brain injury.
Okay,
And
well,
Willie Stewart did a talk last year, and actually he's going to come on in a few weeks so he can update us on his studies and give us some more specifics around that again. And
yeah, he's great.
That's the importance, I think, of our Pink Brain Pledge and trying to get women in these longitudinal studies right now.
Yeah.
we're kind of couple decades behind, and other studies that were looking at other things, the Framingham study, a lot of the other studies are starting to add brain injury in. So I think, in the next decade, it's actually going to kind of blossom into, much more knowledge than we have now. But
yeah, I know there are places in the UK and Scotland that are looking into this now, in specifically women, intimate partner violence, but also women broadly. But yeah, like you said, it's probably 10, 20 years behind, as with most things, and women in medicine are,
Right. And then we do know that repetitively hitting your head is a bad thing. I mean, it was,
we know that.
It was never, football was never called a life sport, right? There was my parents don't let me play football because they want me to, play the golf and, whatever. So, where those numbers go. Also, I do think it's very important, and I get literally, if not weekly, every other week, a woman calling me thinking she has CTE, and that is a very important place not to go. And I personally was there in 2010, 2011, really thinking, looking at what I saw going on in my life and looking at my history of concussion, and really digging into that as defining myself. And that was when my ADHD diagnosis came out. And so much about the things that I was putting into CTE were actually ADHD. And, and going through that process and taking medication, almost all of those things went away. So I think it's important to, if you're struggling with cognitive issues, going down the I may have CTE is a really dark and dangerous corridor. And Willie Stewart will talk to this. Your background history is one of, there are 11 other pillars about, meditation and sports and exercise and eating healthy. There's so many other places to go. So if you're struggling cognitively, work on that and the other pieces around. The CTE piece is important to throw your ring in the hat to study, but you cannot, there are doctors out there that are, either misrepresenting or trying to be helpful and say you may be pre-CTE, but that's a really dark place to end up. And I think there are a lot better channels to go down at this point. Get involved in research, right?
Yeah, totally. And, again, social media can be a great, for all its sins, like it can be a great resource. So like Willie Stewart, for example, is very active on Twitter. He's always happy to answer questions in like a DM. So, I think the traumatic brain injury and concussion in sport Twitter is actually very helpful. And majority of people are there for the right reason, which is to ensure the information gets out there, ensure people can talk to each other, ensure those things are shared. So it's a good place if you've got questions, but the Willie Stewart doing this will be fantastic. So what's that next?
I can't exactly remember what day he's on.
Well, whenever he does.
Soon. Coming
soon.
Well, I definitely recommend reading this book. I found it incredibly fascinating knowing the people in the book. I am honored to be in the book. I appreciate being there and just having so many people I love put together how we can move society forward to create a space where sports can be enjoyed, people can be safer and look after each other.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. It's how we look after each other.
Definitely. Thank you for being on the show, and let people know where they can find you.
I'm on social media, but you can go to my website, which is just www.hanawalkerbrown.com. I think I'm the only Hana Walker-Brown in the world. So if you Google me, I'm sure you'll find me. Hana, Hannah. And then I'm on Twitter.
And then the broccoli production pieces, are those also linked?
Yeah, so I'm creative director of a podcast production company, so called Broccoli Productions. So it's linked from my website, so you'll find it on there for all of our own podcasts.
Some awesome. So I'm really glad that you are in the world and helping to help people.
Likewise.
Thanks for being on the show, and thank you for everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Hannah. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.